Hi everyone, it's Shem. Here's another video, this time about how to install a larger tank onto Honda CRF250L. Before I jump to the actual installation procedure, I want to talk to you about why I decided to do it and the options that are available on the market. But if you cannot be bothered to watch that, use the shortcuts in the description down below to jump to the section that you're interested in. Right, so without further ado, reasons why. So initially when I got that bike, I was and I am still pretty happy with the range of the original tank. I live in the United Kingdom, so when I go green laning, there are plenty of petrol stations everywhere, and it was never a problem for me. We always stop for a little bit of a break between green lanes anyway, so getting to the petrol station was never an issue, and it was relatively smooth without having to go off your way to actually get to one. So I don't have a problem with the stock tank when I use the bike in the UK. However, I always fancied doing some of the Trans-Euro trail in Europe, and for that I think I could do with having a bit more petrol in the tank. So initially when I purchased the bike, I installed an SRC pannier rack, which comes with a bit of a petrol canister on its side. You might have seen my other video about it. And the idea was, if I ever run out of petrol in the main tank, I can always use petrol from that canister, and that should be sufficient. But then when I've been using bike in the UK, I've been trying to reduce the weight of it, trying to unbolt things that are not necessary and things like this. And I started thinking about this whole rack system, and although it was the lightest, or it is one of the lightest racks on the market, it's still 4.5 kilos plus the weight of the petrol in the canister. So you're adding extra weight just behind the real axle, which is not the best place to be adding weight, to be fair. If you add weight anywhere, probably adding it behind the real wheel, it's not the best place to do so. So I thought, well, is it really the best idea for me to use that, and if I ever go to Europe, to have that with me on the strips, especially that I'm planning to do a lot of off-roading. And I thought, you know what, let's try something else. I purchased soft luggage, completely soft luggage. I'm gonna do a separate video about that, but ultimately that meant that I no longer needed the metal rack, so I saved the weight of the rack, but that also meant that I did not have any room for the petrol canister, separate petrol canister. So I started looking on the market, what are the other options to extend the range of the bike. And there is one which is called Camel Tank, which is like a tank that you can mount over here when you remove your sort of storage compartment. So I considered that as well. But again, that's adding weight close to the back of the bike, which again, not an ideal place, but out of the two places, I would probably prefer that Camel Tank rather than carrying the extra canister using that SRC pannier rack. Anyway, in the end I thought, this is where the manufacturers put the tank, and they've got probably good reasons for doing so, and that's because the weight, although it's fairly high up, it's still close to the center of the bike. So I started looking at different options that I could go for, and there aren't that many companies that actually do these tanks. There is Acrebis, which I think they are based in Europe, and they do some tanks, but I know that over the years, from what I've read on the forums, the fit and finish of those tanks and the installation procedure wasn't really very smooth. And then there is also a company in the United States called IMS, and they've been doing plastic tanks for ages, and I've started looking at them. And they do a 3.5 gallon version of that tank, and they also do one when you can put the metal, they can put like a machined metal ring around it, and you can use your original lockable cap with it, which would be great. But I started pricing it up, and by the time I had the shipping, VAT and import charges, the extra tank would, the different tank would cost me something like £450, which is, again, it goes back to the value for money. Do I fancy spending that much money on a budget bike just to extend the range? And you know, to me the answer was no, so I kind of gave up until I found a tank on eBay which looks pretty much like a IMS tank, but it's made in China. I'm not sure where the IMS tanks are made, but if you look at it over here, it's basically that tank here, right? It looks very similar, if not identical, to IMS. I didn't really check for exact differences, but it cost me, I think, with import duties and everything delivered, less than 200 quid. 200 pounds. So when you think about it, that's less than half of what I would have paid for the IMS tank. So I thought, you know, for that amount of money, yeah, it's a bit of a risk, because you know, there are different quality products made in China. Some are great, some are not so great. So I'm taking a bit of a risk, and it doesn't come with any manual, so we're gonna have to figure out how to install it. But you know, I've got a manual, I know the bike fairly well, so it shouldn't be that much of a problem. So yeah, that's pretty much it. That's my reason for getting this particular tank. It's basically, you know, better value for money than I could get from other tanks, and I fancy trying it. I mean, if it's not gonna work well, or I'm gonna have issues with it, then I'm gonna have to look at alternatives, but for now, I'm gonna go ahead and see if we can install it on the bike and how to go about it. Installation wise, I mean, we've got a number of different components. Some are fairly obvious, you know, that will be a breather for the top cap. I can also see there is that O-ring here, which I presume goes over here, and that gives a second seal to the cap, because there is an O-ring inside as well, so it should ideally seal around the perimeter of here, and I think this is just the additional layer of security, although I'm gonna have to check underneath just to make sure that it's not supposed to seal anything here. I mean, it doesn't look like it, the diameter is similar, but you know, I think the seal from the petrol pump will go around the perimeter of that, so I'm pretty convinced that goes at the top. And then there are also the mounting brackets, which some, I presume, looking at the brass inserts here, will be going like this, but I'm not gonna install them until I remove the original tank to see how far apart they need to be and so on. And same goes for this, which I presume will be going somewhere here, and then the rest of it I will have to remove the original tank to figure out, you know, what goes where. But overall, the first impressions are that, you know, it shouldn't be too difficult to install, and it's actually pretty well made, and the tank. So we're gonna start by draining the petrol. I know you could do it with the petrol in the tank, but you know, I don't really fancy it, and if I need to move the tank in a funny angle or something, I don't want any leaks, especially that I'm doing it indoors. So I'm gonna put a bit of a hose in here and try to just transfer the petrol to the canister over here. Petrol has now been drained, at least most of it. There is still some residue remaining in the tank, but you know, it's as good as I can get. If you're doing that, remember to get the longer hose. I could only find a short hose in the workshop, and I didn't have enough time to purchase a longer one. So when you're doing that, just get yourself a meter or meter and a half hose, and it makes life much easier than trying to, you know, faff about with getting a petrol canister close to your bike and so on. Second tip is, it's always better to blow than to suck, and you know, to get the petrol out of the fuel tank instead of trying to suck some through the hose and risking petrol getting into your mouth, which is never a pleasant experience, trust me. It's better to actually create a seal with your hand and blow some air into the tank, and this way it pushes the petrol out of it and you're not risking petrol getting into your mouth. So when you do that, I definitely recommend the latter method of doing it. Right, so to remove the tank, we'll have to just open up the bike a little bit. First of all, the seat is on top of tank, so we're gonna have to release it by removing these two bolts here. Once the seat is released, we're gonna undo these bolts and release the side plastics. And then once the side plastics are released, we'll undo these bolts to get the side plastics here, and there will also be some rivets. I've actually lost one over here, but there's a rivet here, not rivet, there's actually a, like, yeah, I think it's a plastic rivet with a kind of threaded plastic insert inside. And also on the other side of the bike, what have we got here? Yeah, we've got a bolt at the top, bolt over here and bolt over here, and I presume there will be a bolt underneath holding one of those fairings here. So once we remove the seat and the side covers here, I will do a close-up so you can see exactly what bolts are where. One comment to make over here is, remember when you the side plastic cover, it's held here by a rubber insert, so you have to pull it that way. That's not a problem. In this side, it's held by a plastic pin, so you actually don't want to be pulling it your way, you want to be sliding it this way to make sure that it's nicely released from the pin. So remember, yeah, don't pull it towards yourself, just pull it sideways towards the end of the bike, and same goes for the other side. And just pay attention, because the actual bolt that's holding the plastic cover on this side, it's a one-piece bolt with a bit of a bush over here, or a bit of a wider area. And then this one that came from this side, it actually has a bush that goes into a plastic fairing, so just remember what goes where. Okay, let's move to the front of the bike now. Again, similar story with the bolts on the other side. On this side, it's basically a mirror image of the other side. So the shorter bolt with the fully threaded area goes at the top. All the other bolts that hold this fairing, they've got that sort of wider bush over here that goes into the plastic. So just remember that the short one, fully threaded, goes at the top. And before we can actually remove that, as you can see, it's still being attached to this plastic component over here. So we're gonna have to probably detach it over here, and that should release it. It appears that we will need to remove this plastic cover to access the tank mounting bolt, so I'm gonna leave it here for now. There are three mounting bolts, really, as far as I can tell. There are two at the front, one on this side and one on the other side, and there is a through bolt which you can actually see better from this side. If you have a look over here, if I can get it to focus, this is the bolt that goes through that hole in the rubber bush that's inserted into the mounting point in the tank, so we're gonna have to remove that. Now, there is one thing that I'm not 100% sure about, because I don't think I'll be disconnecting a fuel hose or the petrol pump electric connector harness. And the reason for that is that I'm hoping I'll be able to just remove the pump from the tank and insert it into the other tank without the need of disconnecting any petrol hoses. If I was to disconnect petrol hoses, it would be a best practice to release the pressure from the system. So I would disconnect the petrol pump, turn the engine on and start the engine running, just so it can reduce the pressure in the system, and then turn it off or wait until it stalls, and then I'll be able to safely remove the fuel hose without risking it being under pressure. But because I'm not planning to remove the fuel hose, I'm gonna just proceed with taking the tank off. And if it turns out that the hoses are too short and I'm having to remove it, then I'm gonna take you through that procedure. But for time being, let's try to release the bolts that are holding the tank and see if we can lift it up and have a look underneath. Okay, luckily the bolt towards this side of the tank is threaded on the other side, so I don't have to hold it with a spanner, because it would be quite a tight location. So I'm just gonna remove it from that side, and that should do the job. Now all of the bolts are removed. I've provisionally lifted the tank, and it appears that the fuel hose is long enough. However, the harness that connects to the fuel pump is relatively short, so before lifting it up I'm gonna have to disconnect it, and I'm not sure how well you can see it. It's that connector, I think it's 5-pin connector over there, that needs to be removed. So I'm gonna just press it, that will leave the hook, and pull it out to disconnect it. So before I do that, I'm gonna actually disconnect the negative terminal from the battery, just to be on the safe side, and then I'm gonna proceed with disconnecting that petrol pump harness connector. Okay, there are a couple more components that will need to be disconnected before we can leave the tank off properly. So the first one is, I believe that's to be a breather valve. So I'm gonna get some small, like needle nose pliers, and try to remove that metal clip, slide it down, and then disconnect the hose. And this is purely so when the petrol volume reduces in the tank, there isn't a vacuum at the top. It can actually suck in some air and allow petrol to flow. And also, if the petrol expands or there is a lot of gas in it, it will breathe through that hose as well. And in the worst case scenario, when the bike tips over or something, the hose inlet is at the top of the tank, so a little bit of petrol might drain through that, but it's not gonna be too bad. So I think that's how the original breather in the tank is designed. So we're gonna remove that, and we are also going to remove a clamp. Well, not necessarily remove, but just disconnect the clamp that clamps the fuel hose over here. So I'm just gonna release it and slide the fuel hose out, so I can actually maneuver the tank whichever way I want. Okay, so as you can see, I've lifted the tank off, so the only thing connected to the fuel pump right now is the hose. So we're gonna have to remember which way the fuel pump is connected to the tank. Before I even attempt anything else, I'm gonna measure up the distance between those bushes and see how they need to fit into the other tank, and same with the bush at the bottom of the tank, just to make sure that all the mounting points are in correct places. And I'm also gonna clean that up, because I don't want any crap like this falling into the petrol tank when I swap the fuel pump. So it's a good idea to kind of have it fairly clean. Right, I've cleaned it up a little bit. I also measured the distances and what goes where. So we're gonna start by putting the fixings onto the tank. So let's start with the top, when the saddle is mounted. The stock tank has like a T-bar which is welded to the tank. I think this one's supposed to have that push. So we're gonna use the longest bolt that they provided, and then I'm gonna put a drop of Loctite on here and just attach it. so now we need to attach these pieces of metal. They are basically there to provide the mounting points for the fairings, which on the stock tank were just welded to the tank. So I'm gonna go back here and just attach them using those Allen key bolts. Right, we've got this attached now, so let's remove the rubber bush from the stock tank and try to insert it here. Okay, so the next component that we need to mount is this piece of rubber. It doesn't exist on the stock tank. The stock tank is held only by those two. It appears that this plastic tank also rests on the frame, and in order to do that, you've got that rubber thing that allows it to, you know, rest on the frame. So I'm gonna put a bit of Loctite in here and tighten this up. Yeah, don't want it too tight because you're obviously tightening rubber, so I think I might have over tightened it already, so I'm gonna just step back a little bit, and that should hopefully do it. Okay. And now there is a question of this, because I've got two different types of bolts. So I've got those Allen key bolts, which are slightly shorter, and then I've got those hexagonal bolts which are slightly longer. So the question is, I've got 4 of each, which one should I be using for which? And based on my initial investigation, I think we're gonna be using those hexagonal bolts to mount these 2 mounting points, because when I've tried them on here, they are sticking out too much. So even with the plate of the fuel pump, when I screw it in all the way, I still got like 3mm gap, so they cannot be tightened more than the depth of the hole here, which might not be ideal. So for this reason, I'm gonna use the hexagonal bolts, Allen key bolts for the fuel pump, and then I'm gonna use the those bolts to mount the connectors on the tank here. Okay, I have provisionally put the tank on the bike. I've used the original mounting bolts to put to connect the tank at the front. Obviously, by the look of it, they are way too long because the original bushes were much longer, so I won't be able to use this, and there are no bolts supplied with the tank that would be appropriate for that connection. So I'm gonna have to get some bolts for that and make sure that they're appropriate length, but hey, not a biggie. So the reason why I put the tank on the bike is to make sure that it fits well, and the things that I want to be checking for is, you know, can I put it all the way down? And at the moment I can't. It seems like the bottom of the tank is sort of pushing the harnesses, so I'm gonna have to put the torch underneath and see exactly what seems to be causing the problem. The last thing you want is for the tank to be touching against anything metal. The vibrations are a killer, and metal rubbing against the plastic tank is a recipe for a failure. So I want to make sure when the tank is fitted, it's only mounted, or the only connection points are where they're supposed to be. So that bush over here and the 2 mounting points at the front. Everywhere else, I don't want the tank to be touching anything else. Okay, so it appears that it's not too bad. The main thing that's preventing us from putting the tank all the way in is this hose here, which basically gets pushed down by the tank. So my idea is either to put it like this so it sits on the side of it, slightly above the other hoses. I'm gonna try it with a bit of tape first and see if I can put the tank in. If that doesn't work, I'm just gonna unclip that and route it slightly differently so it goes on this side of the frame and then underneath here. The other thing that's preventing us from putting the tank all the way in is that harness. So I'm gonna see how that's gonna behave once I routed that hose differently, and we'll see how much pressure does it actually put. Is it worth us unclipping it now and routing it slightly differently, or can we just simply, you know, push it closer to the frame and fit the tank in between this? So yeah, I'm gonna give it a go now and report back in a second. Right, I have now cable tied that hose to the frame, and it did the trick. I can put the tank lower down, and that doesn't seem to be as much of a problem as I thought. So the only thing that's preventing me from lowering the tank is actual petrol hose that attaches to the fuel pump. So the next step for me would be to remove the fuel pump from the stock tank and offer it up to the aftermarket tank, and then try it on the bike again and check everywhere if the tank touches anything. One more thing to note, when I've been playing with putting the tank on and taking it back, there are metal clips that basically slide from the top onto the frame, and they are basically like a threaded metal clips, and they allow you to put the mounting bolts in. It's been an absolute pain because the stock tank has its anchors quite tight, so they've been coming off. So to make my life easier, I put a drop of super glue on them, and it's been absolutely fine. I just put them exactly in the center, drop of super glue, and they never came off after. So again, mini tip, but very helpful when you are trying to make sure that the tank doesn't rub against anything. It's important to remember the way how the tank was routed. So the actual petrol outlet from the tank was pointing towards the front of the tank, and then it's been routed around the right hand side of it and through that cable clip over here. So I'm gonna have to make sure that it's exactly the same way when I attach the fuel pump to the new tank. Right, this has been a little bit more complicated than I anticipated, mainly because of that float. I didn't realize how big it was, and you know, it was a bit of a fiddly job to actually get it out of the tank. So yeah, you just have to be rather gentle with it and put it in an angle where you can actually take this bit out of the tank first, and then slide the float out. But yeah, it's fiddly, so not ideal. Be careful with it. Right, I've cleaned around the pump now, so I'm gonna put the aftermarket tank on the bike and try to put the fuel pump in. The seals are looking pretty good, so you know, fingers crossed I'll get away with using them as opposed to having to replace this. But yeah, let's put it in the tank now. Right, so we've got the fuel pump attached to the tank. I've not really put any Loctite on, or I've not tightened it properly yet. This is purely just to see how the tank is going to be sitting on the bike. Is it still touching any harnesses or hoses? So I'm gonna offer it up to the bike and see how well it fits. Provisionally put the tank on the bike, and as you can see, the front bolts are through, just to correctly position it. And when we look at the bolt on the back, let me just see if I can put the light on here. Not sure how well you'll be able to see it. Yeah, this one over here, it doesn't seem to be aligned with the hole. It's not far off, but I wouldn't be able to put the bush through it. So the idea is to take the tank off and release those front mounting bolts, those hexagonal ones, and then try to slide the whole mount backwards, just to give it a bit more room so I can slide the tank forward a little bit, and hopefully that will allow me to align this this bush over here. Right, so the mounts have been now moved forward and attached to the tank. I offered the tank up to the bike, and I was actually able to align the mounting hole of the tank with the mounting hole on the bike. It was still slightly further back, but because it's a rubber bush and the front is rubber bush, I've managed to just push the tank forward a little bit, apply a little bit of pressure and put the bolt through. So you know, in terms of mounting points, that's pretty much done. I'm just gonna go back to the other side of the bike now and cut off the bottom bit of this mounting bracket, which I already mentioned because I don't like it rubbing against the plastic here. There's one more thing that I wanted to mention related to the tank position, and you know, initially I was pretty happy with it because it wasn't touching any metal components on the bike, but looking at it now being properly fixed in place, there is actually no gap or very little gap between that wing and the radiator guard. So I'm gonna have to, well, most likely I don't think I'll be chopping that off, but I will probably either try to bend it slightly differently or put a piece of an old inner tube in between so there is no metal rubbing against the plastic. So that's the first thing. Second thing to bear in mind, the actual fairing mounting bolts are in different locations now. So previously the radiator guard mounting bolt was also the fairing mounting bolt, and it's basically underneath the tank, which means I cannot access it right now. Obviously tank is not fully mounted yet, but you know, something to bear in mind that you will probably want to tighten the radiator guard first before you actually offer the tank up to the bike, because the fairing will actually screw onto the bolts on the tank as opposed to you know, mounting points on the frame. And the story is very similar on the other side, where you've got again, fairing mounting point is over here. It's actually a brass inlay in the tank, and the one that you used to attach the fairing to before, it's underneath, and it's actually a metal bracket welded to the frame. So and you know, judging with my finger, that metal bracket is really close to the tank. So I'm gonna remove the tank. Actually, it's touching it. So I'm gonna remove the tank and try to either, you know, hammer it a little bit to make sure that it doesn't touch it, or put a piece of rubber on it to make sure that no metal touches the tank. It's just the rubber in between the metal and the plastic of the tank. So once I slice that off, that's gonna be the next step for me. After trimming those mounting points, I've actually measured the distance between where the fairing goes and that, and marked up which angle they're supposed to be attached. This saves me kind of having to twist them afterwards, so it's better to measure it first and mount them precisely where they need to be. So first you measure the distance on the fairing between two mounting points, because it always stays the same, and then you measure the distance between that mounting point and this mounting point here, and that gives you the angle of how this is supposed to be mounted. I also want to avoid any type of sand or debris coming in between the metal and the plastic in case it kind of rubs or something like this. So I've just put a double-sided tape with a bit of foam in it. So I'm gonna make sure that that sits in between just as an extra layer of protection. And I will probably do the same thing at the front. Right, obviously there is no manual for these bolts, but I'm using 9 Newton meters. It's a standard torque for a M6 bolt, and I'm hoping the brass insert will be able to withstand it. Because I'm now pretty happy with everything, I'm gonna remove this and attach them properly with a drop of Loctite, and I'm gonna put a double-sided tape underneath them as well with a bit of foam, just to prevent any debris getting underneath and rubbing. And then for the fuel pump, we've only provisionally installed it, so I'm going to just double check the seal again, just to make sure that it seals around the perimeter, and put a drop of Loctite on these bolts and torque them up to the correct setting. And once this is done, we'll then investigate the places where a tank might be rubbing against. Right, this is again M6 bolts, and we've done 9 Newton meters on the other bolts, and the brass inserts in the tank seem to be holding up fine, so I'm gonna apply the same torque to this. Before I torque up the bolts that hold the fuel pump, I just wanted to double check that the seal looks okay. And initially, at the beginning of the video, I think I might have mentioned that the fuel pump's gonna be sealing around this aluminium ring. That's not the case. The seals are actually slightly narrower, so they will be sealing against this plastic area of the tank here. So before I actually torque the bolts up, I'm gonna clean it. As you can see, there is some white residue here, so either previously it came off my gloves that I've been using, or it's been on the tank. So I'm gonna wipe it off with the degreaser, just double check that there is nothing on the rubber seals, and then I'm gonna torque it up, going in a sort of crisscross pattern. Right, a little update about the bolts, just to save you some trouble if you are doing similar procedure. I've used the shorter Allen bolts to attach the fuel pump, and I used the torque of 12 Newton meters, which I took from the genuine Honda manual. And it seems that because the bolts are relatively soft and they are stainless, it's very easy to round them off, especially when you're kind of applying 12 Newton meters of torque. So it's kind of borderline of what they can withstand. So I had to actually get rid of the bolts that came with the tank, and because I rounded most of them off, and replaced them with the similar stainless steel bolts that I've had in my workshop. So they're just ever so slightly longer, so I put a little bit of a washer here, and I used the proper hexagonal bit that fits really well in the bolt or in the screw. So I've managed to actually torque them up to 12 Newton meters and avoid rounding them, which is a good result. Thinking about it, probably whoever designed the tank, they meant the larger hexagonal bolts to be used for the fuel pump, and those Allen head bolts to be used for all the mounting points. However, the bolts that came with the tank, at least the bigger ones, they were too long and they would be sticking out of the holes, so this is why I didn't want to use them to mount the fuel pump. But in hindsight, I probably should have cut them off and make them slightly shorter, and it would be much easier to apply the necessary torque to tighten the fuel pump. But hey, lesson learned. If you can do that, I would definitely recommend it. Use the Allen bolts for the mountings, and if these hexagonal bolts are too long, just cut them and use them for the fuel pump just to get the necessary torque, which is 12 Newton meters. After the fuel pump installation, it's always worth turning the tank upside down, putting the torch through the inlet hole on the other side and making sure that the float works. You know, in case you put it in a funny angle and you damage something while putting it in, it's always good to just double check that the float works correctly. So I've just turned it over and checked it, and it seems to be fine. It doesn't kind of touch anything, and it just goes up and down as it's supposed to. Okay, so everything that attaches to the tank is now torqued up properly, and Loctite is everywhere, so we're feeling pretty good about it. So before we put the tank on the bike, I just wanted to inspect a couple of places that might be rubbing against it. And because I've offered up the tank to the bike multiple times, I can actually see the marks on the plastic tank, and you can actually distinguish them from you know, soft things touching the tank and hard metal parts. So I'm not sure how well you can see it on the video. You probably cannot see it very well. But I've got a mark somewhere. Let me double check now. You cannot see it in this light. Over here there's like a dark line, and that comes from this bit. So I've already removed metal insert that sits here, but it appears that when you put the tank on the bike, this part touches this side of the tank. So I'm gonna gently tap it to move it that way, and then possibly tap it to make sure that it's sort of closer to the flame. So I'm gonna get a piece of wood and a fairly large hammer and just tap it slightly. If we look on the other side, you can probably see that better. That's all scratched up here and a little bit here, and that comes exactly from where I've been pointing at before, which is, just move that out of the way, which is the radiator mount. That seemed to be sticking out too much, which means that if I'm gonna put a bolt through here, that's gonna make things even worse. So I'm going to have to come up with an idea of how to deal with that. I've not filmed this bit, but basically I was thinking what can be done to, you know, put that mounting point closer to the frame to avoid this bit touching the plastic tank. And I actually put like a chisel screwdriver halfway through that mounting side of this mounting point and just tapped it this way, and then I started tapping it that way as well, just, well, as gently as I could. It's a fairly mild steel, so it moved a little bit and it started bowing out on both sides. And once I had a little bit of bow on each side, I then put the hammer through a little bit of wood on this side and started tapping from here. Obviously the radiator guard was removed. So it's not very pretty, but you know, I much prefer to have a nasty looking mounting point rather than a hole in my petrol tank. So you know, given the choice, it was a no-brainer for me. And as you can see, it's no longer touching the plastic tank anywhere, which is perfect, what I wanted to do. Even with the fairly large screw head, it's not really touching anything on the tank, which is a success. So the next thing that I will need to do, because some of the paint came off while I was doing it, not surprisingly, so I'm gonna put it, I'm gonna use a bit of a hammerite and just put a coat of it over it and let it dry overnight before I actually touch it again. So that will be a next step, and I will probably try to find a different bolt with a slightly flatter head. As you can see, this has now been touched up with hammerite, so that will hopefully prevent it from corroding in the future. So I'm gonna have to leave it drying for a day. Because I removed the radiator guard, I also use that opportunity to bend it slightly. So what I'm planning to do is maybe add additional washer here between the mounting point and the radiator guard, and that will slide it this way, and then I'm gonna put a bit more of a bend on that wing of the radiator guard, and I'm hoping that it's long enough to actually reach the mounting point here still, and then be slightly further away from a plastic tank, but we'll have to see. I can always bend it back to the previous shape. So apart from this, because obviously I'm going to have to wait for this to dry, there is one more thing that I wanted to do, and that is fill the tank with a little bit of fuel, leave it overnight and see if the fuel is leaking or not. Well, I'm hoping it's not gonna leak, but you never know with stuff like this, so no harm in testing it now, especially that I have to wait for this bit to dry. Right, the tank is now filled with petrol, and because I'm here by myself, I put a bit of a not double-sided, painter's tape around it just to keep it in place, but I didn't want anything sticking onto it too much. It's just very wobbly, so it's a good idea if you're by yourself and you don't have anyone to hold it to kind of secure it so it doesn't move when you're filling it with petrol. Couple of things to mention when you do it: just make sure you've put enough petrol to cover the fuel pump. So that's the first thing. And then second thing, when you're working with petrol, especially indoors, be very careful of petrol vapor, because you might not realize, but it can be fairly dangerous, and a little spark can cause a lot of trouble, especially when you're not sensitive to petrol smell. So I always try to have either the garage door open, or I've got an extractor fan going on all the time, and it's fairly big and it moves quite a lot of air, so you get a fresh air getting into the garage, and you know, hopefully petrol fumes are ejected outside. Okay, so going back to the project, as you can see, I've put a bit of a paper towel underneath, so it's easier to see any leaks on that, and so far it looks fairly dry. I cannot see any droplets of petrol or anything like this, but obviously this is under, you know, stationary, same temperature conditions. We're gonna have to see how it looks once the engine heats up, because obviously once the tank is on the bike, there will be a lot of heat coming off the engine, and I'm not sure how that plastic's gonna behave with a lot of heat going onto it. You know, in my flex, in my expand, so you know, let's wait and see once we have a tank on the bike. But I'm gonna leave it like this until tomorrow, and see if there were any leaks by sort of early morning, midday tomorrow, and if there aren't any, we're gonna continue with mounting the tank on the bike. Here we are, day after. The hammerite is dry now. I have fitted the radiator guard with some extra spacers on the side, and I bend it slightly this way, so hopefully that will prevent that from touching the tank wing. And then we're gonna inspect the tank. It's been there overnight, if there are any petrol leaks or anything unexpected. So it looks like everything is dry as I wanted to see it, so no issues. I'm gonna inspect it carefully, but then if I don't find anything, we'll just fit it on the bike. Okay, it doesn't appear that there were any leaks from the petrol pump area. I couldn't smell any fuel around the perimeter of the petrol pump either, so it's all looking promising. I'm gonna then go ahead and fit the tank onto the bike. It will be a good time to connect back the fuel pump, because if you remember, we disconnected it when we were messing about with it, because the electrical harness was quite short. So we're gonna connect it first, and then we're gonna bolt the tank to the bike. The tank has now been fitted on the bike. I've used 6 Newton meters for the front bolts because the mounts that come with the aftermarket tank, they've got a fairly soft aluminium bush, so if you use any more torque you will most likely squash this bush. So I've used just the drop of Loctite and 6 Newton meters for the front mounting bolts, and for the one on the back the same. I've used 6 Newton meters and a drop of Loctite. This doesn't need to be extremely tight, it's only holding the weight of the tank through the bush, so there are no kind of side forces working on it, so don't worry about kind of torquing it up too much. It's better to do it less with a drop of Loctite. So mounting wise, we're in a good position. Final checks. So I've mentioned that gap between the radiator guard and the wing of the tank, and as you can see there isn't much, but there is a gap there which I am pleased about, so no metal is rubbing against the plastic of the tank. And if you look deeper over there, let me just move the torch, you should be able to see the bolt over there, and it's actually both the bolt and the mounting point are far away from the tank, which is where I want it to be. And same goes for the other side. I've already inspected that, and that's that mounting point underneath the tank wing is far away from the plastic as well. So from that point of view, everything's fine. I'm gonna have to check it every so often, because obviously once you start going off-roading, things will move, things will settle down, so the gaps might reduce. So I'm gonna have to keep an eye on it and decide how to act if the gaps indeed reduce in the future. It's also a good idea to check all of the hoses and cables to make sure that no hoses are trapped underneath the fuel pump or tank, and that everything is as it's supposed to be and routed correctly. So from that point of view, there are no changes how it used to be when the stock tank was on the bike, so no problems here. At some point we'll of course have to deal with the original vent hose for the stock fuel tank. I think I'm just gonna sort of block it up and cable tie it to something here, just so it stays there in case I ever want to reuse the stock tank, because there's no point removing it, especially if I might go back to the stock tank at some point in the future if I was selling the bike or something like this. So the next step for us is to connect the battery negative terminal back and try to start the bike up and see if the fuel pump and everything is working as it should. Okay, big moment. That sounds normal. Indicator, okay. Okay, it appears that it's working as intended, so I'm going to top up more fuel just to do a final check to make sure that the fuel gauge is working. As you might have noticed, there was only one bar because I did not put much fuel in it, so I'm gonna put the rest of it now and see if the fuel gauge is working correctly. Right, I've topped up the fuel. I had a full stock tank of petrol, which was approximately 8 liters, I think 7.8 or something like this. Anyway, and the gauge was showing a full tank with a stock petrol tank. So if we turn it on now, the gauge is showing almost full tank, which kind of makes sense because this tank is wider, it's got cavities over here, so basically the same amount of fuel would show the lower level in the tank. And also, when I said to check if the gauge is accurate, it's obviously not going to be accurate, because it will get to the highest point and it will stay there, because that tank is also taller, so you'll have fuel above the float of the fuel gauge, which, you know, I could look at possibly changing it and bending the float higher up or something like this, but we'll see how it's going to behave. To me, that's not really an issue. As long as it indicates to me when the fuel is getting low, then it shouldn't be a problem. With all of that being said, let's assemble the bike now. We're going to start with the right hand side of the bike, and the installation of the panels is basically a reversal of the removal, with one exception. The front panel over here, it's got a little bit of a plastic trim, which I don't believe will be able to fit. It normally sat over here, but I don't think I'd be able to slide it in between the fuel tank and this bit. So for that very reason, I'm gonna just unscrew it from the fairing, and then I will mount the fairing on the bike. And as mentioned before, we're going to be mounting it onto the tank as opposed to onto the frame mounting points. And remember, the short bolt, fully threaded, goes at the top. The longer bolts with that wider flat area towards the bottom, they go for the two bottom mounting points. And then also, if we continue towards the middle of the bike, when we attach the middle fairing, we have to remember to use that bolt which's got a sort of bush on it, and it actually attaches over here. Oh, by the way, manual doesn't state any torque settings for any of these bolts, so I'm just gonna hand tighten it, or maybe put a drop of Loctite and do something around 6 Newton meters. Okay, and the last thing on this side, we just need to put that plastic rivet back in. So you need to get it into this position, and then once you insert it, you just push that bit and it spreads these legs further, and it prevents it from coming out. When I was removing it, I foolishly tried to do it with a Phillips screwdriver because I thought it was threaded. It's actually not, so you just need to push it from behind, or try to pry this bit out if you can when you're removing it. But for inserting, once the holes are aligned, you just push it in. Not sure if I can do it with one hand, but I'll attempt to. Like this. And that's rivet in place and pushed in. Okay, there should also be one more rivet here, which I lost during probably one of the crashes, so I'm gonna have to purchase one and put it in, and that will hold that fairing in place. In terms of left hand side of the bike, very same thing. We'll start with the front fairing. Again, the shorter bolt, fully threaded at the top, the other bolts over here and over here, which attaches it to the radiator guard, and then we'll do a the middle fairing, and then we will put the seat back on. Not sure if you've noticed from the video, but because the tank is slightly wider than the stock tank, it pushes the fairings wider apart, and that means that they are coming to this point at the slightly steeper angle, which results into things. Whenever you fit the middle fairing, it's really hard to slide it because that's now on a steeper angle, and obviously they connect with each other through those two teeth that are sticking out from the front fairing. And then secondly, the gap is bigger, but you know, not much you can do about it. It actually doesn't look that bad, but you know, something to bear in mind. So let's crack on with the seat installation. The M8 bolts, manual states 21 Newton meters, so we're gonna just put the seat, slide it forward and fit those two bolts. This is how the bike looks like with the new tank fitted on. It's not that different. You can tell the tank is slightly wider and slightly higher because you get that crease on the seat. But other than that, I'm pretty happy with the way it looks. You know, no complaints from me. Yeah, so pretty happy with that. Final thing from me, my favorite subject. Let's look at the weight. So if we put the stock tank on the scale, okay, that's 3054 grams, and then we put the plastic trim that we've taken off and a couple of these screws. We've got 3084 grams. Okay, the plastic tank, when I checked its weight before, it was 2247 grams with all fittings. So everything that I put on the bike is just over 2 kilograms. Everything that I've taken off is free. So I've saved about 839 grams, which I'm really pleased about, because that means that the new tank is much lighter than the stock metal tank. Yes, I know I'll be putting more fuel in it, so all in all, it will probably end up heavier, especially for the longer journeys, but I always have an option not to fill it up completely. So, you know, something to bear in mind, and, you know, lighter is better. So pretty happy with the results. Thank you very much for watching. I appreciate that it has been a fairly lengthy video. So if you have any questions or comments, just write them down in the description below the video, and I'll try to do my best to answer them. See you in the next video.